tell you a little bit more about me, just so you know where I'm coming from here. My expertise initially was in emotion learning and memory, and I'm a neuroscientist and trained as a cognitive psychologist. I got into the research in race bias when I was at Yale, and my colleague was Masra Banaji. She's now at Harvard. So all of this research that I present to you today is collaborative, my contribution being the emotion decision-making part, hers being the work on race bias. And most of the studies today I present will be done by either Damian Stanley or Jenny Cabuto, at least the most recent, the decision work, both of whom are postdocs on the job market. So just to give you an outline, I first want to outline the problem that we're talking about very briefly. I'll spend the vast majority of my talk talking about the science of race bias in decision making, starting with just how do we measure race bias and its neurorepresentation. And then I'm going to just give you a little bit of what we hope to be doing in the future, sort of inspired by our research on neuroscience of race in terms of targeting race bias in decisions. So the problem, I think this is not something I have to tell this audience, but it's, there's this perception of bias in the legal system, but it's not just perceived bias. Black males are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white males per capita. The likelihood of jail time is higher for black males for equal offenses. Hispanic and black males receive longer sentences than white males for equivalent crimes. Inmates, interestingly, with more Afrocentric features, whether you're black or white, receive harsher sentences than those with less Afrocentric features. And there's a big difference in, I'm going to use this as a pointer, in sentencing and the decision to impose the death penalty, particularly when the severity of crime is somewhere in the middle. So there's abundant evidence that unintended, and I'm assuming it's unintended, I can't be sure of that, race bias influences legal decisions. So how do we conceptualize this psychologically? Well, social psychologists talk about 2 types of attitudes. Explicit attitudes, these are what you consciously, explicitly express to me. These represent your beliefs and perhaps your intentions, and implicit attitudes. These are expressed through our actions, not without necessarily our conscious effort or control. They often reflect the cultural stereotypes that we're all exposed to, whether we like it or not. And often, at least in the case of race bias, also often the affective associations that go along with different race groups. And they're measured, one of the ways we measure them, and I'm going to mostly focus on this measure today, is the implicit association test. So I'm just going to walk you through that in case you're unfamiliar. So the way the implicit association test works is you are sitting at a computer screen. You're going to see a number of stimuli come up on the screen one at a time. And they're going to be faces that are either white or black, or words that are either good or bad. And this is getting at the affective associations between races. And the way it works is you're asked to press a button as quickly as possible. In this case, press a button on the right. If it's a black face or a good word, press a button on the left. If it's a white face or a bad word. And so you go through this one at a time, face, word, so on. You do that for about half the trials, and then the contingencies change. So now you're going to press a button on the left. If it is a black face or a word that means something bad, press a button on the right. If it's a white face or the word that means something good, and again, you'd go through these. This is actually a classroom demonstration where I make people do this. I'm just saving you from all of that. But what you would find in the average white American is it would take you longer to respond when black is paired with good and white and bad with bad than the opposite pairing. For African Americans, they are actually, as a group, there's no bias on this task, but there's a lot of variability across the group. So our first, given that we knew the amygdala was important in affective learning, and in our work it showed that really as it's expressed through your bodily response indirectly, years ago, this is ancient in brain imaging world, this was done in the late 90s, published in 2001, we asked, is the amygdala linked to these implicit affective associations? So we brought in 14 white American subjects, meaning Yale undergraduates. They viewed unfamiliar black and white male faces. While they were in the scanner, just simply had to say, was this face presented before or not? And after the brain imaging, we gave them one measure of explicit race attitudes and two sort of indirect assessments. One was the implicit association test. The second was really a measure of an affective response. So if I go like this, got somebody's attention. You would startle. You will startle more in the presence of something you find aversive. And so we showed them black and white faces, played loud noises, measured how much they blinked their eyes, which is part of the startle response. In general, our population looked as we expected. They showed evidence of implicit bias, taking longer to respond to black paired with good and white with bad than the opposite. And they startled a little bit more in the presence of the black face than the white face. We then correlated that with brain activity, and we found within the amygdala, and that's here. Let me just point this out. It's really right here. It's not such a big part of the brain, about the size of your thumb, tip of your thumb. We found in the amygdala for both of our implicit measures, the IAT and startle eye blink, we found greater amygdala activation when you're doing black faces relative to black, and that correlated with how much bias you showed on these implicit measures. So that was really just the beginning. This was the first study looking at the brain and implicit bias. We have a lot more research now, so I'm just showing you this. I'm not going to go into all of this research because I really want to get to some of the decision-making work. We really know a lot about a network of brain regions now involved in processing race. We talked about the amygdala, which is these race-based evaluations. The fusiform face area is involved in identification of race from faces, and so some of the effects you see in other race eyewitness identification might be related to activation there. If you can detect that your implicit bias is in conflict with your attitudes or beliefs, you might show more activation of the ACC. In other words, if you feel some discomfort or something. And the DLPFC seems to play a role when we actually try to regulate our biases. So I want to get to the second part of my talk, which is linking this to decisions. And this is the bulk of my talk. So we know amygdala activation is linked to both the expression of implicit race bias and judgments of trust. So you show more amygdala activation when you're looking at faces you deem to be untrustworthy. So this led to the obvious question: is race bias predictive of economic decisions to trust? So participants were given a series of slides like this. How much would you like to share with this person? So the trust game, I'll describe in a second. The faces were either black, white, or other race. And I'm going to focus on black and white. And you have the option to share anywhere from $0 to $10. And the way the game worked is, here's your partner. You have $10. You can choose to keep your $10, in which case you get $10. You can share some portion of it. Let's say you share $7. Your partner now has, you have $3 left over, but your partner, we've now quadrupled that, your partner has $28. Your partner has the choice to keep the $28, in which case your trust was violated. You end up with $3 instead of 10, or the partner can share the earnings with you. So now you have 17, your partner has 14. So here I've plotted, this is the frequency of offers. I'm going to give you an example of one individual. So IAT D, D is the measure we use to talk about the extent of implicit race bias that you have. If it's a higher number, it's a stronger pro-white bias. 0 is no bias one way or the other. If it's below 1, it's a stronger pro-black bias. So here we see, these are the offers from 0 to 10. Here's the percentage of time you gave that offer for white partners or black partners. Sorry, my mouse is not working. Black partners. And this is somebody with a slight pro-black bias. Here's somebody with a strong pro-white bias. You can see they gave higher offers in general to their white partners. And we found a strong correlation between implicit race bias and your decisions to trust other individuals. And I should say, most of these studies, we actually used mixed race populations. So we get a range of scores. What about decisions to punish? So we know that decisions to trust are linked to choices to implicit race bias. This is something called the ultimatum game. It's another classic behavioral economic game. In this game, you're always playing a partner. The partner has $10, and they have the option to give you part of their $10. They can give you 5 of it. They can give you none of it. But you have an option too, and your option is to refuse the offer. If you refuse the offer, you don't get anything, but neither do they. So it doesn't make any sense to refuse any offer because you lose money. But yet, if someone offers $2, people often refuse it. They'd rather lose the $10 to punish the guy for giving a crappy offer. So we gave, again, this task to a number of subjects of mixed race. They were 60 black partners, 60 white partners, 40 other race partners. We only gave offers between 0 and 4 because we know about $2 is where people's decision point tends to be. And what we found was that you are more likely to accept, there were equivalent offers for black and white proposers. You accept a higher proportion of offers from white proposers than black proposers. The point of indifference, meaning you accept 50% of the offers or reject 50%, was higher for white proposers. This is actually incorrect. That should be 186 than black proposers. In other words, you're willing to lose some money to punish the black proposers more. So in economic games, implicit bias related to the trust and punish even when there's a personal cost to you. What about decisions related to the cause of behavior, why people engage in those behaviors? We call this attribution. So if you see this guy, he cuts you off in traffic, there's different scenarios you can imagine. He could just be a jerk. Let's just walk through those scenarios. One is he's rude. In other words, you attribute the action of the person to their disposition, who they are. We tend to do this as human beings, probably more so than we should. We call this the fundamental attribution error. This is overweighing dispositional explanations for behavior. You could also, however, hear about the situation. He was very rushed. He had to get to a meeting. If you know that information, you could take that into consideration and make a situational attribution. He's not a rude guy. He was just rushed. This we know takes a little effort. You need more cognitive control. When you're stressed, you do this less. You give situational attributions less. So we did the same experiment. We gave people black or white people to make judgments about, individuals to make judgments about. Here's an example of what they saw. Tom left the restaurant in a hurry without tipping the waitress. Tom's baby was screaming. And you asked then, was the behavior caused by the situation or was the behavior caused by the disposition? What we see when you are making judgments, attribution judgments about negative behaviors, not positive, you're more likely, if it's a black individual, to attribute the behavior to the disposition than the situation relative to white individuals. And this is correlated, how much you make this attribution bias for negative actions is correlated with your implicit race bias. What about jury decisions? So we set up a mock jury situation we used jury-eligible participants, but they were still recruited through NYU, so it's not sort of the diverse population that you might like. We gave people a real trial, and they were given a lot of information, essentially all the information the jurors were given, so this was quite a long experiment. There were a number of bit of pretrial information. They then heard parts about the trial. They actually saw video. This was on court TV. Saw video from the trial, the parts where we could not show the face of the defendant. The only thing we varied was the face of the defendant. Is it a black individual or a white individual? But they essentially saw everything the jury would have seen. Then they were asked to make a number of decisions, and guilt decisions. They didn't just ask if they were guilty, but were they guilty on all counts? I should point out this case had someone shot somebody. They sort of shot into a crowd. Someone was sort of hurt, minorly hurt. But this was a result of a big party going on, and somebody threw something in his window, called the police multiple times. There were lots of he was a war hero. There were lots of circumstances here that made you kind of question, what's the level of responsibility. So the question is, how guilty is this person, on which counts as well? And here I'm just going to walk you through this for a second because it's a little complicated, but I just want you to focus on the red and the blue lines. The red is the white defendant. The blue is the black defendant, And we see an interaction. It's not we don't see a main effect for guilt decisions, but we do see an interaction between implicit race bias and decisions of guilt, particularly as they relate to severity. What about responsibility? This is much like your attribution judgment. Is this person not all responsible, partially responsible, mostly responsible, completely responsible? Again, an interaction between your implicit race bias and your judgments about the white defendant and the black defendant. And finally, what about sentence length? How long do you think this person should be put in jail? And again, an interaction here with the more severe sentences going to black individuals if the person making the decision has a higher implicit race bias. So what I've suggested to you so far is that under a lot of different circumstances, trust decisions, punishment decisions, attributing the cause of behavior, and actually jury decisions, we can find evidence, and it's not huge effects, but they are significant effects that implicit race bias can change decisions, or can guide decisions, I should say. We might want to ask, can I look at your brain and tell how biased you are? So we published this paper just this year. This was the work of Tobias Brosh from my lab. And remember, I'm just showing this to you again. So we focus on a couple of these areas that I'm going to talk about. The amygdala, since that's sort of the star of our show, and also the fusiform face area. And we only found some evidence that activity patterns in the fusiform face area can predict high or low implicit race bias. We didn't see this in the amygdala. This may be partially the way we did the analysis. This is, as far as I know, the first study anyone's done to look at this. I expect we can do better with new revised techniques, but this is where we are now. And the point I want to make is our ability to predict your race bias as being high or low is only less than 10% above chance, right? So here's our sort of high race bias individual, and we're about 58% chance correct when 50 is chance. So the answer to this question is barely, not really, I think, at this point. And I think we'll get better at this. I'm not sure if we need to do this, but the science isn't there yet. Finally, I just want to conclude with what I call the hope. And what I mean by the hope is, can we now find ways, we sort of documented, you look at the legal system, you have sense that there's a problem. We've documented that at least implicit race bias is linked to a number of types of decisions that are relevant in a legal context. Really what we would hope to get out of this is some way to diminish the influence of implicit race bias more broadly, and perhaps in a simple way that we could actually enact in a legal context. So can we diminish the impact of implicit race bias on legal decisions? I'm going to give you one example of a study that did that, but the results aren't great. So they did implicit race bias as assessed with the IIT, like I showed you. The race of the experimenter was varied. It was black or white. And what you see here, and you're focusing here on just this little difference here. This is when you pair black with good and white with bad versus the opposite. When the experimenter is white, that diminishes. When the experimenter, sorry, I'm losing my mouse here, is black. This was also done in a legal context. So when you have a homogeneous or a diverse jury, and you have to make a decision about a defendant who's black, we see a difference in the percent of guilty votes. This is primarily prior to deliberation. It doesn't seem to last through deliberation. What we're hoping, and this is what I've showed you so far, is we are developing a neural model of implicit race attitudes. And what's interesting when you look at the brain is we start to see the overlap in brain regions involved in implicit race attitudes and regulating them and their expression and other things we care about. And the other things we care about, in my lab at least, are the regulation of negative affective responses. So a lot of my work right now is trying to figure out how do we diminish fear responses? What are some of the novel ways we can think about actually changing your fear associations, perhaps in a permanent way? And we think about this in the clinic, but we're also trying to start to apply this to changing implicit bias. I would have nothing exciting to present on that today, because that really is the hope and the promise, but it's not the results yet. So just to sum up, for this last part, what we hope to be able to do is exploit techniques to change affective responses because they might yield insight into techniques for diminishing unintended race bias in legal contexts. So first I need to thank all the people who did the work and inspired the work, and all of you for your attention. Thank you.